What's up, everybody? Gather around because it's time for another episode of RFA Insider.
That was Eugene and I'm Amy, and today on RFA Insider, we'll be talking about the U.S. turning over Tibetan artifacts to China and why that doesn't sit right with some observers and members of the Tibetan diaspora.
And then in the second half, we'll head over to The Hague, where the Philippines' ex-president will stand trial in international court over his deadly war on drugs.
So let's get things started as we go offbeat.
人生乜女話呢？
咪嚟提，集中為主題。딴소리하지 마.
All right, this is the segment that we call Offbeat, and it's where Amy and I will talk to an RFA journalist or an expert about a trending story or topic that we ourselves are not experts in. Hence, we are going off our beat or offbeat.
So today we're going offbeat with Tenzin Pema, who's the director of RFA's Tibetan service. And we're going to talk about how the U.S. recently handed over 41 cultural artifacts to China, some of which are Tibetan Buddhist relics. So welcome back to the podcast, Tenzin.
Thank you so much for having me back, you guys.
Yes, and it's also the 1-year anniversary since the last time you made an appearance way back in episode 2. You might recall that at that time we were talking about a Chinese development project, building a dam that would have sunk in several monasteries and villages in Tibet. But today we're talking about something slightly different. It's about some artifacts from the U.S. that are being, I guess, quote-unquote, returned to China. But the thing is that many of these artifacts are, in fact, Tibetan. So let's start the questioning up. I'd like to ask, first of all, how much of the problem is that these artifacts are being called Chinese, given that the handover ceremony, at least, it was called the ceremony for the repatriation of Chinese cultural objects. So how much of the problem is that Tibetan artifacts are being called Chinese cultural objects?
Yeah, I think one of the major problems with this handover is definitely that it is, called Chinese cultural objects, and but it's also that of the use of the term repatriation,
right?
Because essentially, as we know, it means the return of a thing to its country of origin. And so I think these are the two that are problematic. And why these things problematic is because it feeds into or endorses China's narrative that Tibet has always been a part of China or the motherland. And it's also a problem because it kind of advances China's systematic and ongoing efforts to distort Tibetan history, to erase Tibetan identity, and also to appropriate Tibetan culture and assimilate Tibetans into the larger Han culture. So essentially, I think these are what the problem is, but also mind you that is happening in the larger backdrop of all of these things that are happening in Tibet, right? The assimilation policies, the aggressive Sinicization of Tibetan religion, as well as culture, the rampant use of teaching of Mandarin, and the erasure of Tibetan language. So I think these are the problems.
Okay, and the people who are most opposed to this would be within the Tibetan diaspora or I guess scholars, right?
Yeah. So, of course, Tibetans as well, definitely, but then also cultural and art experts, as well as, people both here in the U.S. as well as in India and other parts of Asia, academicians and scholars as well who've expressed their disappointment in this move.
Okay.
All right, so let's talk about the actual objects. As mentioned before, there are 41 of them being repatriated, quote unquote.
Repatriated.
Yes. So how did they even end up in the U.S. in the first place?
So we went through multiple Chinese state media reports, and all of them say that they were, quote unquote, illegally exported from the country. And so the handover was done by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office's anti-trafficking unit. It's a mouthful, but essentially they did the handover this year of 41 such objects. And it's very interesting to note that their website does not have any information about the handover. Whereas the Chinese consulate in New York actually has put this information up, and also of the event that happened marking the handover. And it's also interesting to note that the same office in New York has actually handed over a lot of such items to other countries, like most recently to Nepal, some 10 different cultural objects. But they usually publicize all of that. But whether it was the 41 this year or the 38 last year, there's no such announcement on the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. And we've actually tried to reach out to them multiple times, but we've not heard back from them. Whereas in Chinese state media, as well as on like Chinese social media platforms, they've actually gone to town with this, and they have a list of different items. And the items like you asked about, this time they list items that include Tibetan Buddhist relics as well as Buddha statues.
Mm-hmm. Now, just to be clear, all 41 objects are not all Tibetan, right? Only some of them?
Yeah. Not all 41 are Tibetan. Like I said before, there are only some of them, and these are the ones that are supposed to be Tibetan Buddhist relics, as well as Buddha statues. But if you go back to like last year, for instance, there were so many of them that were Tibetan objects.
Okay. Now, when we use the term Buddhist relic, is that a specific? Does that have a specific meaning? Because sometimes a Buddhist relic will be something like that specifically the Buddha handled. That I've read in certain stories where we cover, maybe in Southeast Asia. So does it just mean like it's a religious artifact, or is it like a super important thing with an actual history and connection to Tibetan Buddhism from ancient history?
Yes, so I think if you go by the actual definition of relic, you're right, it would be something directly related to the Buddha. But in many of these instances, I think what we're hearing and what we're seeing from, like the announcements that are out, they also pertain to other artifacts that date back to history, like it could be Buddhist mural paintings, remnants of that. It could be Buddha statues dating back to, let's say, the Tibetan Empire of the 7th and the 8th century. It could be various items. Like, for instance, and the 38 that was, sent back last year, they had the Guru Padmasambhava Buddha statue. There were also other, wood carvings as well. So a whole different set of items.
Okay, and these... Do we have an idea of how old these particular objects are, and maybe how rare they are, for example?
So this particular period, they said that it is dating back from anywhere from the Neolithic era to like the Qing dynasty, which is like spanning like such a huge duration. But I think the previous time they talked about it spanning from like the Ming dynasty as well, Tang and Qing. So various periods. But the interesting thing is also that some of the art experts have kind of questioned the duration of some of these items, whereas like last year, some of the Buddha statues they said were actually more recent ones of like the 20th century as well as the 18th century. So another thing to note is also that when you talked about how these items were actually found, right? And while there's no information in terms of how they were seized by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, what we read is also that the Chinese government was called upon by this office to verify whether these objects were indeed Chinese. And so, and apparently they seized them in November of last year. And essentially, the Chinese government verified that they were Chinese objects.
Okay.
And that they needed to be returned.
I guess I just have a question is, how were these objects taken out of Tibet in the first place? Do we know anything about that at all?
So, as you know, like, for instance, there are various, there's the Cultural Revolution that took place where many Tibetans tried to save a lot of cultural, things that would define our history, our identity, right? And at that period, China obviously destroyed so many different monasteries, all of, like, the, Buddha's very statues, and many texts, anything that pertained to Tibetan history. And so during that period, we had a lot of Tibetans who also tried to save a lot of that. Then you have also many art experts and others who've tried to preserve and protect all of this in over various periods of time, whether it is in the West or in Asia. And essentially, I think you see some of these coming off like that, yeah.
I see. So that's very different from when you normally hear stories like this. It's, I guess, kind of reversing the trend of colonialism where a colonial power will go into another country and take cultural items. But that's not what's going on here. These people were trying to protect these artifacts from what you're saying, from the Chinese Communist Party. And then in the intervening years, they just, I guess, were held by the diaspora and now seized and are being sent back to China.
Yeah. Okay. So it could be by the diaspora, by, art connoisseurs here in the West
I
and
see.
others. Yeah.
Okay.
So you've touched upon it a bit, but could you go more in depth? What are some of the biggest reasons that people don't want China to have these artifacts?
I think, like I talked about, the cultural assimilation that is happening. All of those reasons are true. The fact that it feeds into China's narrative, but the other reasons are also that the handover is taking place from the U.S. to China, right? And essentially, as you know, the U.S. last year signed their Resolve Tibet Act, and essentially that is meant to bolster America's Tibet policy. And one of the key aspects of that act is that it asserts that, the PRC and the CCP are historically inaccurate in claiming that Tibet has been part of China. And it also goes on to say that U.S. Has to fight this disinformation and the distortion of Tibetan history and facts. And so what you're seeing now is that China's using a lot of these ancient finds and, archaeological finds as well as cultural relics to, again, further its own narrative. And so essentially, this handover is a violation also of the U.S. policy on Tibet. And then another aspect, I think Eugene asked about, who are the people who are opposing this, right? And so we are hearing from people in various museums as well as in art and institutions as well, who are saying that this is a lost opportunity for Tibetans and for academicians to also understand, Tibetan history, because you are actually giving these back to the hands of the CCP.
Right.
And what I think he pointed out about colonization, as well as handing it back to the colonizers. How do I say that? Colonizers.
Oh, we're handing it back, in this case, yes. Handing it back to the colonizers.
Yeah, exactly.
If you define China as the colonizer, yes. Yeah. So let's get more specific. How can China, let's say, okay, China has this Tibetan statue. Mm-hmm. How can they use that to advance their narrative? I mean, would putting it in a museum and then with an inaccurate description, or what specific way could they use that to advance what they want to what they want the world to believe about Tibet?
Yeah, I think various ways, right? For instance, we've seen that the CCP has relied on, shaping their historical narratives to boost their image abroad as well as, at home. Mm-hmm. And in 2024, for instance, even not just with Tibetans, but even with Uyghurs, archaeological finds that they've used that to make their territorial claims. And essentially, so we're seeing a lot of that. But for instance, earlier this year itself, China's National Administration of Cultural Heritage, the head of that, he talked about how the country is working to advance the return of key cultural relics to the motherland and basically to use archaeology to better explain Chinese civilization. And with each of these findings, what they're doing is that they are rewriting the history books. And essentially, they are actually explicitly saying that the textbooks are being rewritten to better explain Chinese civilization, Chinese history based on all of this. And of course, I think the other examples that you've talked about, you've asked about are where they would take some of these artifacts and say that, okay, there is a shared history between China and Tibet, and it dates back to this era, and hence, there's always, Tibet has always been a part of the motherland.
All right.
Yeah, I think reading this story reminds me of Taiwan, for example, in the National Palace Museum. During the Chinese Civil War, the Kuomintang, they took the best treasures from China and brought them to Taiwan, just bring it with them as a way to say hey, we're legitimate. Look, we have the cultural heritage.
Right. All right. So let's look at things from the point of view of, okay, the United States decides, okay, we're not going to take these artifacts and we're not going to give them to China. What would be the best way to keep steward of these Tibetan objects?
I think if you look at Dharamsala and you look at India, basically the preservation and the promotion of Tibetan identity is best done there under His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And you're seeing all of that, whether you go to the Tibetan settlements or you go to the Tibet Museum, Dharamsala. I mean, it's called Little Tibet for a reason, many of these things. So I think one would obviously be that as an explanation. But the other options are also for museums here in the West as well, which is actually a place where there's a lot of study and promotion of Tibetan history being done. And in the past too, there have been many, Westerners who've actually donated to these museums, and even Tibetans have talked about how they are getting the respect and that is due. And as such, I think there are all these different options other than returning or sort of like repatriating, quote unquote, to China.
I guess to follow up on that, if those artifacts were sent to like Dharamsala or kept in the U.S., is that enough? Or would the ultimate solution be returning them to Tibet?
Or returning to Tibet at a time when, I guess, a more responsible government there would be able to keep a good steward over these objects and not distort their history, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that, but also more immediately, for instance, that there be better transparency about how these objects are being seized, where they're being seized from, and how they have been, quote unquote, illegally exported. And also, I think the question is about when you have like the anti-trafficking unit that is calling on the Chinese government to actually do the studies. Could there be more professional academicians, art experts who could actually come in and do all of that? Can actually Congress look into this and see how the American policy, cultural policy could be redefined? I think those are some of the larger questions and more immediate questions that need to be answered.
Those are some very deep questions indeed. Do you have any other things that you would like to say? Some closing thoughts on the matter before we move on?
Like I said before, I think the importance of this story or this development is the fact that, there have been about 594 such cultural artifacts that have been sort of repatriated, quote unquote, to China. And many of them include items from Tibet. There's been... This has happened since 2009 when the US and China entered into an MOU to sort of protect and preserve cultural heritage. But essentially, this whole act is a violation of the preservation and promotion of cultural heritage. And another interesting thing to note is that the premise under this agreement is also that it's under the 1970 convention. But you have to remember that in the 1970s is when China was actually, actively taking part in the Cultural Revolution and, resulting in the destruction of many monasteries in Tibet. So it's kind of ironic. And I think these are things that one needs to reflect on, from a historical standpoint, but also more immediately the backdrop of what's happening inside Tibet.
Okay.
All right. So on that note, we'd like to thank you, Tenzin, for coming on again to RFA Insider. Stay
tuned. More RFA Insiders coming up next.
Thank you, Tenzin.
Thank you very much. You're listening to the RFA Insider podcast, made by two real-life staffers at Radio Free Asia.
If you'd like to send us feedback, there are many ways you can do this.
If you're listening to us on YouTube, you can write us in the comment section below.
You can also send us an email at insider@rfa.org or tweet at RFA Insider.
Or you could even visit us in person.
No, don't visit us in person.
Right, don't visit us in person. But do check out our webpage at rfa.org/English/insider to see our profiles and read summaries and show notes for every episode.
So tune in every other Friday and we'll take you behind the scenes.
And tell you what the news really means here at RFA Insider. All right, so very interesting situation coming out of the Tibetan service with the handover of all those cultural artifacts. It really makes you think about how we label things. For example, would we feel comfortable calling, say, a Native American artifact a U.S. cultural object?
Maybe not, considering how, I guess, Native American groups are treated in the U.S.
Right. For me, though, I think it would depend, though. Why would you call it that? What's the point of doing that? Are you trying to erase their history? Or are you trying to say, for example, that if you define it as a cultural object, then maybe that would allow it to have some kind of protection or preservation under U.S. law,
Right.
And then you still say that it's a Native American artifact, not that, this is something that is belonging to America, but rather based on the situation of what happened in the past, this is something we should preserve because we have to preserve the Native American communities or Native American history or knowledge about Native Americans, then don't think I would be totally opposed to calling it a cultural object, but not necessarily of the United States, but rather from within U.S. territory. You know what I mean?
Yeah, fair. So what matters more is how it's used.
Yes.
Or treated.
Yes, and I don't think that if anyone who was trying to call it a U.S. cultural object wouldn't be trying to erase the history of the Native Americans, because that would just be ludicrous, right? At least I hope. But I think that it all boils down to the trustworthiness of the entity that is going to be steward of the object in question. And as Tenzin was saying, that in the case of Tibet, those objects could be used to, reinforce the narrative that China wants to put forward.
And we've already covered, stories in the past about, museums in Europe that have labeled Tibetan artists as from Xizang rather than from Tibet.
Right. And there's been a lot of buzz back and forth about that, developments. I think in one case, one of the museums decided to walk it back, and they were just going to Tibet.
A lot have relented, I think, but only after a lot of pushback.
Right. But it's important to have these conversations, because otherwise, people wouldn't know that that's even a problem.
That's true.
No, it's important to have that conversation to correct people's perceptions about what they think, how people in the world want to define themselves.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Okay. But enough about that. Let's get into Podcast Free Asia. So today on Podcast Free Asia, we'll discuss a listener comment. And so this comes from, once again, the episode we did about Red Note with Sherazad from Uyghur Service.
Oh, okay.
This person's name, I can't really know how to pronounce it. It says Shoritzo Bandit.
Shoritzo Bandit.
Does that mean something?
I know. I'm just trying to make it sound
So the comment is, it's curious how many usernames in the comments use first name, last name, 1, 2, 3, 4. Surely nothing weird going on there.
Okay.
So have you looked at our comments?
I have, but I've not paid attention to the usernames.
Yeah, well, after I read this, I started looking at it, and it turns out that there are a lot of comments where it will be exactly that format. It'll be first name, last name, and then 4 numbers.
Out of curiosity, are they Western names or Asian
Sometimes. Actually, usually it's Western names or names that would appear Western, but still sound totally unnatural. You know what I mean? So it tends to be that they'll put a profile picture of somebody who looks not Chinese, usually a white person, right?
Okay.
And then the comment will either be, in this particular episode anyway, it was either a pro-China statement, a pro-Red Note statement, or an anti-US statement, or an anti-RFA statement, accusing us of lying in some way or another, or pointing out that you're wrong here with what you said, you're just parroting propaganda or whatever. So people with usernames in this format in the comments of other episodes, they also would be used to dispute what our guest was saying. For example, when we're talking about the North Korean soldiers in Ukraine, one of the usernames with this format was quick to point out that Asians live in Russia too, and that there's no proof that there are any North Koreans in Ukraine, which I think pretty much now we can pretty much say that yes, there are, with all that's been going on. And so if you click on these accounts, usually they have very few subscribers and they don't make any videos themselves, which I don't think that's that weird, because I don't have any videos on my YouTube account,
right?
And I don't have, but then I also don't put a profile picture. I just I have an account because I use YouTube, but I don't want people to find me there, right? It's not like a social media, so I don't think it's weird that they don't have that they don't have lots of videos and subscribers. But the other thing is they always put a profile pic in, which I think that might be kind of fishy. Like you want to present yourself as, if you didn't want to reveal who you are, if you wanted to impersonate someone else, the easiest way to do that would be to get a profile pic from somebody that you wanted people to think that you are, right?
So this is ringing alarm bells for you.
Well, yes and no, because all this is to say, we can't confirm that anything fishy is going on, but we can say that it appears that there's a trend.
Okay, a trend is forming.
Yeah, that if somebody has that format, then probably they're going to take issue with something that we said. So yes, we can certainly understand why it seems like something could be afoot, but actually we looked into it, and it turns out that when you sign up for a new YouTube channel, if the name has been taken already, then they just assign you 4 random digits.
Or even if you don't put a username and you just sign up with your email or your Google account, then it will just automatically generate. Right.
So that is to say that maybe something's going on here, but has nothing to do with the 4 digits.
Yes.
If you know what I'm saying. Okay. But of course, I also wanted to say that we welcome all comments, regardless of the motivations for leaving the comments or anything that's going on. So please send us your comments.
Yes. And that's all for Podcast Free Asia. So Double Offbeat is next.
All right.
靚生乜女話呢？
米嚟題，tập trung vào chủ đề. 딴소리하지 마.
Double offbeat.
Okay, so now on RFA Insider, we're here to do double offbeat. And briefly to explain why we have two segments called offbeat, it's because one time we had two interviews unexpectedly, and we decided, hey, why don't we just do, for this episode, two offbeat segments? But that's now seeming to happen more often all the time because RFA Insider is such a dynamic podcast and everybody at RFA wants to come join us here. So welcome to Double Offbeat.
All right, and today on Double Offbeat, we're talking about former Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte, who was seized at Manila Airport on Tuesday by local police acting on an arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court, or ICC. So the charges were crimes against humanity, specifically Duterte's crackdown on corruption and illegal drugs, which earned him nicknames like, quote, the Punisher or Duterte Harry.
Duterte Harry, wow. So here to flesh out the case for us is Anthony Esguerra, who is the head of engagement at BenarNews, RFA's sister organization, and that reports on security, politics, human rights in South and Southeast Asia. Welcome to our podcast, Anthony.
Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. So to start off, can you first tell us about the charges being brought against Duterte?
As detailed in the warrant of arrest issued by the International Criminal Court or the ICC, Duterte is accused of committing crimes against humanity in connection with thousands of killings that occurred while he was serving as the president of the Philippines from 2016 to 2022. But the court also considered murders dating back to 2011 when he was still the mayor of Davao City. It's the hometown of the Dutertes in the southern part of the Philippines. It's hard to determine the actual number of victims. The government said it's something close to 7,000. But local and international human rights groups claim that there should be 20 to 30,000 Filipinos, most of them poor, who were killed in Duterte's brutal war on drugs.
All right, so Duterte is accused of using the police to excessively use force against the people to fight this war on drugs.
Mm-hmm.
So is there a lot of evidence then that the police used excessive force in these cases?
Well, to begin with that question, the police is heavily involved in the war on drugs, but there were also unidentified killers, usually wearing masks during the operations.
Mm-hmm.
So we can't say if they are police or there's some random vigilantes, that's what we call them in the Philippines, who are conducting this, what we call extrajudicial killings or EJK. But let me answer the police part. Even before Duterte became president, he was the mayor in Davao City, as I mentioned, where he was also the head of the infamous Davao Death Squad. So this Davao Death Squad or DDS is a household name in Davao City. And supposedly when you do something bad, people would call DDS and you could be killed.
Are they a government group?
That's kind of hard to say.
Okay.
But we know that Duterte is the head of that when he was the mayor of Davao City, and that's what also written in the arrest warrant. And so in the arrest warrant signed by the three judges of the ICC, the chamber of the court is, quote, satisfied that there was an attack directed at civilian population as policy when Duterte was the mayor and as the head of the DDS, the so-called DDS, and as the head of state of the Philippines when he was the president. So they believe that this is the state policy at the time. The ICC believed that the attack was both widespread and systematic. As, it's kind of hard to say the numbers, but, Human Rights Watch and other human rights groups have said that the police under Duterte had regularly falsified evidence to justify the killings of suspected drug dealers and drug users. I wrote here addict, but no, that's not politically sound. When Duterte began his presidency, not only the Philippines, was exposed to the bloody images of lifeless victims who the police claimed to be either suppliers or users of illegal drugs. And usually the police would claim that these people were nanlaban. Nanlaban is a Filipino word which means to fight back in English. So the claim is that if they were trying to arrest someone and they would fight back, then they would just shoot them. And they would not, shoot them to... Sorry, it's too graphic. They will not only shoot them to what do you call that? Disarm them, or like to incapacitate them. They would shoot them in the head. We've seen the images. They're gory. They shot them multiple times. And so human rights groups and the ICC in their warrant of arrest believe that this is excessive, systematic, and widespread.
So before you came to Benar, you were working as a journalist in the Philippines, and you mentioned prior to this interview that you had interviewed some of the families of the victims.
Right.
Do any of their stories or like the things they told you stick out that you want to share with us?
I think one of the things that I can still vividly recall and I'm still emotional about is sometime when I was reporting, probably in 2019 or in 2019, there were a lot of families affected by the drug war, and in particular, it's mostly women who were affected because it's their husbands or their sons who were killed. And there was this group of there's a church in this very poor community in the outskirts of Manila that decided to, what can we do for the for the mothers or the wives of those who were killed in the drug war. And they decided to put together this, I guess it's a tailoring cooperative. They call it the Project So, for example. And that's the time when I met, I would say, like 10 to 12 mothers and wives of victims of drug war in one place. I talked to them, and they recall the moment they found out that their husband or their sons were killed, and it's very emotional. Even to this day, I can still remember the pain. And to be honest with you, I'm just a journalist. I am not equipped to, deal with the emotions of it, because probably like when you ask them, like, how do you feel about certain, it triggers trauma. I'm not, many Filipino, and it's not just me, many Filipino journalists were not equipped to deal with that at the time. But my instinct when this happened, or probably this is for a later, but my instinct was to, reach out to one of them. When Duterte was arrested, and I asked them, how do you feel about the news that Duterte is arrested, is now on the way to the ICC in The Hague? You told me that this is what you want to happen. You wanted justice. And they said, like, we're really happy that this is happening. Although one of them is still, still cannot believe that this is happening. And they somehow believe that somehow Duterte can get out of this. Because it's just too powerful. So
as you mentioned, Duterte is next at the ICC detention center in the Netherlands, awaiting trial. And Benar did a live stream from that location, and they filmed a crowd of his supporters gathered outside awaiting his arrival. And even the comments under that live stream, I was surprised. They were all saying things like, "We love our former president," like "Justice for Duterte."
Right.
Can you explain why Duterte remains popular among some Filipinos?
Without a doubt, Duterte is one of the most popular presidents that the Philippines ever had. The numbers would easily back this claim. He has an unprecedented high approval ratings until his last year in office, something 68 to 75. This is incredibly high.
Yes.
Like compared to his predecessors. Duterte is loved by many, particularly because he branded himself to be this, I'm not your typical politician. I am not from the political establishment. I am even before he became president, there's a chance that you haven't heard his last name. Although, make no mistake, Duterte is from a political family.
Okay.
So Duterte is, his relatives were either governors or congressmen of this Davao region, and the most rich city in Mindanao and the southern Philippines. But he claims to be like, I'm not part of the Manila imperialistic political establishment. And he presented himself to be like an ordinary man trying to make a difference in the society. Make no mistake, Duterte has organic supporters, like real people supporters from all walks of life, from ordinary Filipinos, from the poorest of poor, to the most learned, to the rich and successful businessmen. But he also used these troll farms and armies to I guess spread out his message. And when Duterte was confronted about it, like there's this Oxford study that you use troll farms, this is how you spend. And his answer was, I probably have spent more on this.
Okay.
So this is my long way of answering that, yes, Filipinos love him.
I see.
Some Filipinos love him.
And I think...
and there's also the other part of manufactured popularity and love for him.
Okay, all right. So one key thing that you mentioned in that was that he was able to, I guess, paint himself as a political outsider, even though he kind of wasn't. And we've seen that anyway, that casting yourself as not with politicians has been a successful strategy for politicians all over the world, because a lot of people seem to be kind of fed up with politicians in general. So if you can say, I'm not part of the establishment, I'm different, and then that it boosts your popularity as a candidate. Well, let's move on. So as we know now that the Philippines is not in the... It's not part of... It withdrew from the ICC in 2019.
Right.
And Duterte, when he was president, he tried to suspend the investigation into him by arguing that the local authorities were already looking into it. So what has been the stance of the Philippines' current president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., about this?
Well, if you asked him last year, his position, and he said that the position of the government is it will not cooperate in ICC's investigation into Duterte's war on drugs. That was his position, at least from the news reports in November 2024. And what we see now is that the administration certainly cooperated. They were trying to make a nuance that, oh no, we're not cooperating with the ICC because we are not signatory anymore. We withdrew our support to the Rome Statute, which is basically what created the ICC. What they're trying to say is that we were cooperating with the Interpol, and basically the ICC issued an arrest warrant, and the Interpol, acting on the arrest warrant issued by the ICC, released a warrant to the Philippine government. We want to arrest Duterte, and they cooperated with the Interpol. So that's the nuance there. After Duterte's arrest, there is a growing call and pressure on the Marcos administration to return to the ICC.
I see.
And the call is no longer just coming from international and local human rights organizations. It's also coming from, obviously, the opposition senators and, members of the Congress. Many of them are allied with Marcos. So there is a growing call for the Philippines to return to the ICC or probably sign or ratify the Rome Statute again. And we'll have to see what will happen next.
Did something change in the last year that led Marcos to relent and allow the arrest of Duterte?
That's an interesting question, and certainly yes. Marcos is the president of the country, and the vice president is Sara Duterte, who is the daughter of former President Rodrigo Duterte. So just for context, in the Philippines, the president and vice presidents were elected separately in the same elections. Okay. So it's not like here when you vote for Trump, you also vote for Vance. It's not like that. So you have to select your president and you also have to select your vice president. This time, they were a formidable force because the Duterte is really popular. The Dutertes are really popular. In fact, Sara Duterte was leading the polls at the time. So in a way, somebody happened, power was brokered, and Sara Duterte agreed to run for vice president instead of president, and together they won. But we know that this is a marriage out of convenience. And true enough, like just 2 years into the presidency, there was already a crack. Sara Duterte has started attacking Marcos and his decisions and his policies, not only on domestic issues, but particularly on China. They are divided on that. And so there was a rift between them. And certainly, this arrest will change the dynamics of the local politics.
I see. So a lot of machinations within domestic politics that have to do with this. I honestly, I know nothing about Filipino politics. So could we say that Marcos is with one faction and Duterte was with another, and they're kind of political rivals, or are they kind of on the same side?
Okay. They are from two of the most powerful political families.
Right.
They came together to win the 2022 elections.
Yes.
And now they have split.
Okay. So now they're fighting that out, and that's why.
Yes.
Okay, I see.
And let me just add that the Philippines will be having its presidential elections in 2028.
Mm-hmm.
And again, Sara Duterte is leading in the polls.
Okay.
She's young, by the way. And, you know, she's an easy candidate. She can definitely win. And political observers in the Philippines are carefully watching what's going to happen next. But one thing that I would like to add is Sara Duterte, Marcos, once they started, you know, breaking up with each other, the allies of Marcos in Congress have impeached Sara Duterte.
Okay. Well, this is very, very confusing.
It's very confusing.
It's dramatic.
They impeached Sara Duterte, and I guess this is their way to possibly get rid of Sara Duterte before the presidential election.
Okay.
Because if she gets convicted in the Senate, well, the highest form of punishment is she cannot run for office anymore. So all of this, the impeachment plus the arrest of Duterte, will certainly have a huge impact in Philippine politics.
I see. What is next for Duterte then?
What's next for Duterte? Yesterday, he arrived in the Netherlands. He was taken into custody by the ICC. He's now in the detention center, which is so nice, by the way. Have you seen the videos?
Of the detention center?
Detention center.
No.
You should definitely put that as a B-roll in this podcast.
Okay, yeah, we will.
I'm saying that because many of his supporters were crying, there's no judicial process, there's no due process given to Duterte. But, you know, taking him to the ICC, where until now he is assumed, he is assumed innocent until proven guilty, is the due process. And his detention center is actually way better than, what thousands of Filipinos have in Philippine jails. And what's next for him is that, I guess we're waiting for the schedule of his arraignment. He's going to appear before the ICC chamber. And it's the process of the ICC to verify that this is the actual, person. This is actually Duterte.
Right.
And I guess they will have a pre-trial, and they will wait and see if, the judges would decide that, yes, this is a case that we will take on.
Do you happen to know offhand, like, what kind of sentences he might be facing if he's convicted?
Mm-hmm. He might get, murder for crimes against humanity. That's the charge.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you know how many years, ballpark?
I think 30 years.
Oh,
30
wow.
years.
That would, But wouldn't that be basically the end of...
Can you fact check that? 30 years.
the rest of his life, almost? I mean...
That's the rest of his life. He's 79. He's really old and weak. Even when he was the president of the Philippines, like, he was missing in actions for days, and there was, like, suspicions that, he probably died.
Oh.
And, he has an advanced age. Probably, like, the trip to the Netherlands was too much for him.
Okay.
Yeah, I saw quotes from him before, I think, his arrest, where he was like, go ahead and arrest me. Like, come here. Like, I'm waiting. Just get this over with.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much for helping us digest that. It's still very, very confusing, but we can see that domestic politics has a lot to do with this whole situation. So we'll keep our eye on it. Thank you once again for coming into RFA Insider, Anthony.
Thank you for having me.
And for Amy Lee and Anthony Esguerra, this has been RFA Insider. I'm Eugene Huang. We'll see you next time.
See ya.
Like what you heard today? It would really mean a lot to us if you would like, subscribe, or follow this podcast. You can also share it on social media or even text messages. Feeling frisky? Give us a rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or elsewhere. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you here for the next episode of RFA Insider. Sure? Yeah. All right.